His Majesty Charles III, King of the United Kingdom, will soon be crowned in a ceremonial ritual which is nearly 1,050 years old. The British monarchy is even older than the ritual of coronation, and both have their origins in Anglo-Saxon England, which began with several petty kingdoms in England and Scotland ruled by pagan kings who worshipped and claimed descent from the king of the gods, Woden. In this video, we shall learn about the symbols and rituals used in the coronation ceremony and what they mean. But first, we shall learn about the origin and meaning of monarchy itself, to understand this ancient institution which defines our culture and links the British people back to their ancient ancestors and gods. The Anglo-Saxons were the ancestors of the modern English ethnic group, a collection of closely related Western Germanic tribes, the Angles, Saxons, Jutes and Frisians, who migrated to Britain during the 5th century after the end of Roman government in the region. A recent study of medieval Anglo-Saxon DNA by Gretzinger and colleagues shows that the modern English people take between 25 and 47% of their ancestry from these invaders. The roots of Anglo-Saxon kingship are first described by the 1st century Roman historian Tacitus, who reveals that the Germanic tribes called Ingavones, Istavones and Hermaeones traced their origins to 3 progenitors, all of whom came from a divine ancestor called Manus, the son of the god Twisto, whom the earth brought forth. Despite this, Tacitus tells us that their kings were not godlike, but rather their authority was dependent on their charismatic power, which the tribe required for their well-being. Kings were chosen according to the nobility of their ancestry, but the power was not absolute and had to be shared with state-instituted pagan priests who had a monopoly on corporal and capital punishment. We see a similar arrangement 900 years later among the Viking Norsemen, whose free men of a certain class were able to choose which of their nobles would be king. It was far from democratic, since only some men could choose the king, and the king himself had to belong to the aristocracy. But it is clear pagan kingship was less absolute than later Christian kingship. Compare it to the Norman king Richard I of England, who, when accused of having unjustly captured Cyprus in 1193, defended himself, saying, "I am born in a rank which recognizes no superior but God, to whom alone I am responsible for my actions." But the kings of the Norsemen, like those of the Anglo-Saxons, legitimized their rule by claiming descent from the wise god of death, war, and esoteric knowledge, Odin. Woden is the Old English name for the god the Norse called Odin. He is the best attested of all the English gods, but even so, we have to rely heavily on Norse sources to understand him. Woden was also very important for Anglo-Saxon kings who needed to prove they were descended from him in order to make a legitimate claim to the throne. These royal genealogies all follow a similar pattern, with numerous legendary figures included, and with Woden consistently placed at 9 removes from the founder of a dynasty. Beda's Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum was completed in 731 and lists the genealogy of Athelbert of Kent going back to the progenitor of the English race, Hengist, one of 2 divine horse twins who were in turn descended from Woden. He also says that many other English kings were descended from Woden, and the following century, when the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was completed during the reign of Alfred the Great, we see that it contains many genealogies for the royal houses of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, which also include Woden as an ancestor. This was most likely a continuation of a pagan tradition in which kingship depended on a link to the divine, and Woden, like Odin, was a specifically aristocratic god, a god for the elite and the military. In Norway, the same thing happened, with the pagan reactionary Håkon Jarl claiming descent from Odin. The oldest Norse genealogy that survives is in Elegiac, and it includes the gods Odin, Njord, Fjölnir, and Yngvi Freyr as ancestors. A Viking poem called Rites tells us how each of the three classes of men, slaves, freemen, and nobles, are each descended, on the male side, from Rígr, who is identified as the god Heimdall. But Odin is more commonly the god of kings in other sources. The poem Helgetal, composed about 985 AD, begins its account of the ancestry of the Jarls of Hlathr with Odin and his son Samingr. The kings of other Germanic cultures also claim descent from gods. The Amali dynasty of the Goths was supposed to descend from Gabd, which was their name for Odin. But with Christianity, Woden was demoted from a god to a man in a process called euhemerization, and eventually the genealogies were extended back to include the biblical Noah as an ancestor of Woden. In the 10th century, Æthelweard, an Anglo-Saxon nobleman, wrote that the heathen Anglo-Saxons made sacrifices to Oaddan regis barbarorum, Woden, the king of the barbarians, before battle, adding that Hengist and Horsa, the founders of that race, were Woden's grandsons. Therefore, Æthelweard was in agreement with the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the venerable Bede, or Beda, who lived 2 centuries earlier. The kings of England sprung from Woden's loins. This claim can be seen, in practical terms, not only as a way to legitimize kingship, but also as a means to strengthen wider cultural bonds with other Woden-worshipping kingdoms, consolidating a wider racial identity. Divine descent ensured that the king was entitled to his position through right of kinship. Evidence for the kin-centered basis of Anglo-Saxon kingship can be found in the etymology of the word king itself, which comes from kuning, meaning of the kun race. The myth of divine descent was an important principle of political life for Anglo-Saxons, so essential to the structure of English society that it maintained its political function even after we became Christian, which is why Bede, a Christian, included Woden in the royal genealogies. Even the most famous Anglo-Saxon king, Alfred the Great, known for fighting against the pagan Vikings, still claimed descent from the god Woden. The king's connection to the gods also connected him to the priesthood. Among the Anglo-Saxons, the high priests were connected to the god Woden, and they displayed the attributes of that god, such as the spear wielded by Coifi, the Northumbrian high priest, whose name, meaning hooded, connects him to Woden's epithet, the Hooded One, or the South Saxon priest, who took to a barrow to speak spells, just as Odin does in the Norse sources Hávamál and Völuspá. In recognizing the divine origin of their kings, the English share in an ancient tradition found almost universally among all humanity throughout history, from the ancient pharaohs to the natives of Fiji. In India, the imperial sacrifice for the inauguration of the king, the Rajasuya, was a reproduction of the consecration of the first sovereign, the god Varuna. Mircea Eliade wrote that for the natives of the Fiji Islands, the creation takes place at each enthronement of a new chief. Almost everywhere, a new reign has been regarded as a regeneration of the history of the people, or even of universal history. So we must understand the crowning of an Anglo-Saxon king brought his people closer to the god Woden and to the moment when mankind and the world were created by that god, and that this deeply profound religious experience of kingship was preserved after conversion to Christianity, with the King of England deriving his power from the Church and God. The conversion of England to Christianity supplanted the gods and elves with one god, and angels and saints, pagan priests with bishops, priests and monks, and ancient temples and barrows with churches. The bodies of great kings and queens formerly interred in barrows were now laid to rest in magnificent churches. This is not to say that pagan barrows lost their significance entirely. In 1642, our sovereign's namesake, Charles I, addressed his troops from atop a Bronze Age barrow near Birmingham, now known as King's Standing Barrow. Likewise, the claim of royal descent from Woden endured for centuries after his worship had ceased. The sacred king of pagan Germanic societies has parallels in Judeo-Christian mythology, with figures such as King David and King Solomon, aka Shlomo, thereby justifying the continuation of monarchy into the Christian period. Some of the traditional symbols of royal power were also kept. The wearing of crowns was a novel introduction by Christians sometime in the 9th century. Our royal family used 2 crowns today. The imperial state crown shall be worn by King Charles III as he leaves Westminster Abbey after his coronation. Here Elizabeth II describes its provenance.
The crown as you see it now was made for Queen Victoria in 1838, but many of the individual stones have a much longer history. The oldest is probably this sapphire, which is said to have been worn as a ring by Edward the Confessor nearly 1,000 years ago. The pearls are said to have belonged to the first Queen Elizabeth. The story goes that this strangely shaped ruby was given to the Black Prince after a battle in Spain in 1367. I always like to think of it being worn by Henry V during the Battle of Agincourt. It's difficult to be absolutely certain about some of the other stones, because after the execution of Charles I, Cromwell had the crown jewels broken up and sold. The Black Prince's ruby, for instance, was sold for £4, but it was returned to the crown after the restoration of Charles II.
But he will actually be crowned with the St. Edward's crown, which was made for Charles II in 1661, as a reproduction of an older Anglo-Saxon crown made for Edward the Confessor in the 11th century, but which had been destroyed by Roundheads during the Civil War. Our king shall be the 7th monarch to have been crowned with it. But the Royal Sceptre did have a pagan precedent. This stone sceptre was found among the grave goods of the Anglo-Saxon burial at Sutton Hoo, thought to have been that of the 7th century pagan king Radwald of East Anglia. The 4 faces are believed to represent gods, and one of them has an eye struck off, so is identified as the one-eyed god himself, Radwald's divine ancestor, Woden. The sovereign's sceptre represents the monarch's power and governance. Among the ancient Greeks and Romans, the king of the gods, Zeus or Jupiter, was depicted with a sceptre. It is likely the Germanic tribes borrowed this custom from the Romans. In England, from a very early period, 2 sceptres have been concurrently used, and since the 12th century, the time of Richard I, one has been marked with a cross and the other with a dove, 2 symbols of Christianity. Another symbol of royal power derived from Roman pagan tradition is the orb of the sovereign, originally held by the god Jupiter and representing the world. In early medieval Europe, it was combined with a cross and dubbed the globus cruciger, cross-bearing orb. It then represents not Jupiter's but Christ's dominion over the world, and the king holds it to show he rules through Christ.
She receives the orb, symbol of the dominion of the cross over the world.
The sceptre and orb, which shall be used at the coronation of Charles III, have been used in every coronation since 1661. They were both created for the coronation of King Charles II. The crown, orb and sceptre, all of which were placed on the coffin of Queen Elizabeth II during her funeral, will be presented to Charles III at his coronation. While medieval depictions of kings show them holding the orb in the left hand and the sceptre in the right hand, during the coronation service, the orb shall be placed in the right hand of Charles III, as he is invested with the symbols of sovereignty. Afterwards, it will be placed on the altar before the actual crowning. The essential elements of the coronation have remained largely unchanged since Anglo-Saxon times. Britain is one of the few places that have preserved this venerable medieval ritual. We don't know much about the pagan inauguration ceremony of kings in England, but our modern coronation ceremony began in 973 with the crowning of the Anglo-Saxon king Edgar the Peaceful. He had been king for 14 years by the time he was crowned, showing that the ceremony itself did not mark the start of his reign, but was rather a formal and ritualized demonstration of his power. King Edgar had promoted the controversial Dunstan to Archbishop of Canterbury in 960, which was then, and still is, the most senior clerical position within the Church of England, which was then Catholic but has been Protestant since 1534. 13 years after bestowing such power on him, it was Dunstan who, with this power, crowned Edgar, showing that the ritual reciprocity of power sharing between the king and the priests had been preserved from pagan times, imbuing the sovereign with divine power and the church with state power. Edgar was crowned in the beautiful town of Bath in Somerset. But our king shall be crowned in Westminster Abbey, as is now the custom. Would you like to learn more about Anglo-Saxon paganism? I highly recommend my two-part series on this subject, beginning with their gods in part 1, and going on to describe their temples and holy sites and the elves, dwarves, and other entities they believed in part 2. I can only run this channel thanks to the generous contributions of conscientious patrons. I accept several cryptocurrencies and also one-time donations via PayPal, but if you want to get access to exclusive content, then please become a patron on Patreon or Subscribestar.